William the Conqueror, the man who forever changed the fate of England, a duke from Normandy, born illegitimate, who dared to challenge kings and won. But who was the real William? A visionary ruler? A brutal tyrant? Or simply a survivor shaped by violence, driven by destiny? In 1066, England's world shifted. One battle, one man, and an island kingdom would never be the same. For William, known to everyone as illegitimate, the crown of England was the prize of a lifetime, and he was willing to risk everything to claim it. William was born in 1028 in the Norman town of Falaise, the illegitimate son of Robert, Duke of Normandy, and a young woman named Herleva, the daughter of a local tanner. His birth was the subject of ridicule among the nobility. From the very beginning, whispers followed him, William the illegitimate. A boy marked by shame, yet scandal would not deny him his inheritance. When his father set out on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he named William as his heir. But fate struck swiftly. Robert never returned. At just 7 years old, William was Duke of Normandy. It was not a childhood of privilege. It was a childhood of peril. Normandy in the 11th century was a violent, unstable land. Powerful barons ruled their territories like kings, and few accepted the authority of a child. The boy duke was a prize to be seized, a weak link in the chain of power. Plots sprang up around him like wildfire. Guardians appointed to protect him were murdered in cold blood. Assassins crept into his chambers while he slept. Several times, William had to be whisked away in the dead of night, carried from fortress to fortress under the protection of loyal knights. His survival was never guaranteed, but survive he did. The constant threat shaped him. From the start, William learned that trust was dangerous, loyalty fragile, and that strength alone could secure his place in the world. He grew up in the saddle, familiar with sword and lance, as comfortable in armor as in a cloak. The chaos of Normandy forged him, ruthless, unflinching, and utterly determined. By his teenage years, William was already leading men into battle. In 1047, at the Battle of Hastings, he faced down a rebellion of Norman barons who refused to accept his rule. With the backing of King Henry I of France, William's forces clashed with the rebels. The fighting was brutal, but William stood firm. His courage under fire, his refusal to yield, turned the tide. The rebellion was crushed. For the first time, William proved he was not just a boy clinging to a title. He was a duke to be feared. His enemies began to understand the truth. This illegitimate was no weakling. He was a survivor. Hardened by betrayal, sharpened by bloodshed, William had developed the qualities that would define his rule: calculation, resilience, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. By the age of 20, William was already more than a boy who had outlasted his enemies. He was a warrior, a leader, and a man feared by those who once mocked his birth. The illegitimate son of Normandy was no longer fighting for survival. He was preparing to fight for greatness. By the 1050s, William had done the impossible. He had tamed Normandy. A land once torn by rebellion and bloodshed, now bowed, however reluctantly, to his iron hand.
The Vikings had travelled to Normandy about 150 years earlier, and of course they used ships like all Vikings did. But in fact, the Normandy of 1066 was a much more settled agricultural community. There were no longer raiders and plunderers, and that's why there had to be, if you like, a state-organised construction for the crossing.
That being said, when we see the cathedrals, we look at the castles, we can see the incredible artistry, the incredible richness of things that came from Normandy, and we of course have words in our language that follow through from William the Conqueror.
Through relentless campaigns, strategic marriages, and merciless punishment of traitors, William proved that his authority could not be challenged. But William's ambitions stretched far beyond the duchy he ruled. Across the Channel, England was unstable. Its king, Edward the Confessor, was aging, frail, and without an heir. England's future was uncertain, and every powerful man in Europe saw an opportunity. William believed he had already been chosen.
The heir to the English throne was a man called Edward, later named as Edward the Confessor. And in 1042, he came to the throne. But he only achieved that because he needed the help of an earl called Earl Godwin. And Earl Godwin insisted that the king marry his daughter. And so for the last sort of 13, 14 years of his reign, Edward really was a hostage of Godwin and then his son Harold and Tosti.
Edward, who had spent part of his youth in Normandy, had hinted, perhaps even promised, that William would inherit the English crown. And there was more.
King Edward died on the 5th of January 1066, and Earl Harold Godwinson was crowned the very next day. So that was effectively a coup. It was because Harold was on the spot. He was literally at Edward's bedside. And we know that from both from historical writings and from the Bayeux Tapestry, where it's depicted.
In 1064, Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful earl, was said to have sworn a sacred oath of loyalty to William while shipwrecked in Normandy.
So when we're looking at Hastings and the context for Hastings, we are looking at three people who believe they have a claim to the English throne.
Partly because Edward the Confessor appears to have made promises to different people at different times.
One who often is forgotten is Harold's brother Tosti, who had been Earl of Northumberland. There was a rebellion against him. Harold was sent to make peace with the Northerners who were marching south, and Tosti got exiled as a result. And he's actually the first person to launch an attack on England in the spring of 1066. Over the seas, there's Harold, King of Norway. Now, he's a bit of a character. That's one of the last of the Vikings. He'd actually been the commander of the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard, but then eloped with a princess and stole a large sum from the treasury. Well, that's the story anyway. But that money paid for him to be King of Norway. And there were some rather shady dealings that had been done between the Norwegian king and the Danish King of England back in the 1030s that suggested that he had a claim as well.
He rules Norway. He tried to enforce his claims on Denmark. When that didn't pan out, he shifted to claiming parts of England, including claiming the throne of Wessex.
Then, of course, there's William of Normandy. Now, of course, you focus on William of Normandy because he's the one who's successful. But in many ways, he had the weakest claim. The main claim he had was of affinity, that is to say that Edward had spent all that time at the Norman Duke's court being looked after. Duke William, on the other hand, was an illegitimate son of a Norman prince in the 1030s, and so the bloodline claim was always weak.
According to Norman chroniclers, Harold pledged to support William's claim.
You have to consider how people became kings in England in this period. It wasn't always a straightforward patrilineal inheritance, but you could become king by acclamation.
When Edward died in January 1066, everything changed. Harold Godwinson seized the throne, crowned by English lords who saw him as the kingdom's strongest defender.
Harold, in terms of securing his place on the throne, he faces a threat from the north. The first threat that he faces is from Harald Hasdrubal, the Norse king, who is a descendant of King Canute. So at one time, King Canute had claimed or had exerted authority over Norway and Denmark and parts of England. And on that basis, Harald is trying to spend many years trying to, he rules Norway. He tried to enforce his claims on Denmark. When that didn't pan out, he shifted to claim parts of England, including claiming this throne of Wessex. So he invades the northern part before Harold faces off against William at Hastings.
To William, it was nothing less than treachery, a broken oath, a betrayal that could only be answered by war. William moved quickly. He summoned his vassals, called in favors, and promised spoils of war. Knights from across Normandy and beyond answered his call, lured by the chance of land and wealth in England. He secured the ultimate prize, a banner from Pope Alexander II himself, blessing his cause as holy. With God on his side, William declared that his war was not just justifiable, it was righteous. What followed was one of the greatest feats of preparation in medieval history. Along the Norman coast, William assembled an invasion force, the likes of which England had never seen. Hundreds of ships were built, crafted to carry horses, supplies, and thousands of men across the treacherous channel. Knights armed in chainmail, archers with deadly longbows, infantry drilled for combat, all gathered with one purpose: to conquer. By the autumn of 1066, the illegitimate duke had become a general of unmatched ambition. His army stood ready, his ships waiting for a favorable wind. William's destiny was clear. He would cross the Channel, challenge Harold Godwinson, and stake his claim not just as Duke of Normandy, but as King of England. The year was 1066. England stood at the crossroads of destiny. In the north, Harold Godwinson had just faced the greatest test of his reign. A Viking invasion led by Harald Hardrada and Harold's own brother Tostig had forced the English king into desperate battle at Stamford Bridge.
In order to make the Channel crossing, William needed to construct a substantial fleet. And we can see that on the Bayeux Tapestry. There's some wonderful pictures of the carpenters working on creating the boat. He also had to gather the troops together, and he spent a lot of money on mercenaries, which is not something usually remembered, as well as calling on his own vassals and other allies. He also had to look after those troops across the long summer before the fleet actually sailed. Now you might think, oh yes, well he just builds a camp and then that's all done. But in fact, keeping thousands of men and horses in one particular place, it's a real achievement.
The victory was glorious, but it came at a terrible cost. His army was bloodied, exhausted, and forced to march south in haste. William chose his moment with precision. His fleet landed on the shores of Sussex, and the Normans prepared for war. On October 14th, 1066, two armies met on the slopes near Hastings. The English formed a mighty shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, axes in hand, defiant against the Norman cavalry. The fighting raged from morning until dusk. Again and again, William's knights hurled themselves at the English line, but the wall held. At one point, rumor spread that William had been killed.
The main difference between the English army led by King Harold and the Norman army was that the Normans used cavalry. The English, of course, could ride. I mean, any nobleman could ride, but they didn't fight. On horseback, they dismounted to fight. And the whole style of fighting in close ranks, heavy armor, with great axes and so on, was actually predicated on fighting on foot. I think it's quite difficult for modern people to understand how a medieval battle was fought.
You would have had a lot more cutting and hacking than you would have had with a battle with firearms.
We're talking about bladed weapons, and we're talking about men who were probably warriors.
If you were approaching a town where they made a lot of pots and pans on a busy day, the sound of weapons hitting metal and so on was exactly like that.
In a more modern battle, we'd see more people dead with wounds, but in this battle, you would have seen people, literally people having their legs and arms and others hacked off in front of you.
It was close-up, hand-to-hand fighting with swords, spears, axes.
It must have been absolutely intense, energetic environment with absolute carnage as we see on the battlefield.
And if you look at the lower border of the Bayeux Tapestry, you see bodies decapitated, limbs off, and so on. So it would indeed be a really bloody, fierce encounter. And of course, one of the things you can never recover is the dreadful cries of the wounded and the dying.
And so these warriors, to actually face up to this, having marched all the way from Yorkshire, having engaged in this and to withstand this assault, it must have been something which, it's almost unbelievable. It's something of legend.
It would have been a very scary sight. It would have been a horrible type of battle to be in.
In the chaos, he ripped off his helmet, rode forward, and bared his face to his men. "I live!" The Normans roared, their faith in their leader renewed. Then came the fatal moment. The English line, pressed to its limit, faltered. Harold was struck down. Legend claims by an arrow piercing his eye. His death broke the spirit of his army. The shield wall shattered. Panic spread. The Normans surged forward, and the English were cut down. The field belonged to William. On Christmas Day, inside Westminster Abbey, he was crowned King of England. William had achieved the unthinkable, but victory brought not peace, it brought a new struggle.
The aftermath of a battle is always gruesome because there are people dead, people still dying, but also the horses as well, of which many would have been injured and shrieking with pain.
And so this must have looked like an incredible charnel house of men dead and dying on the battlefield. It must have been an absolutely incredible sight, and one that you would never forget.
Conquest was one thing, rule was another.
King William's long-term strategy after the conquest was to assert his authority over the whole of England. By the end of 1066, he can dominate the southeast of England, but in actual fact it takes another 5 years of fairly hard fighting against rebellions, Danish attacks, the sons of King Harold coming over from Ireland, and of course there's Hereward the Wake, who actually sets up a base in Ely in East Anglia, which requires William to mobilise all his land and sea forces in order to control it. After that, he distributes land to his successful warriors. Initially, he tries to integrate the English into the new regime, but because there are so many rebellions, it actually doesn't work. And so there's a huge exchange of the landowning aristocracy, which is replaced by people from the continent. So we're not just talking Normans, Bretons, Flemings, Rhinelanders, anybody who had joined in the great adventure that was the conquest.
England was far from submissive. In the years following Hastings, rebellion flared again and again. The North rose in defiance, joined by Danish invaders. William responded with merciless efficiency. The harrying of the North in 1069 was one of the darkest chapters of his reign. Villages burned, crops destroyed, thousands starved in the winter that followed. To the English, it was terror. To William, it was strategy, an iron fist to crush resistance once and for all. But William was more than a warlord. He was a builder. Across the land, castles rose, symbols of Norman dominance, towering over English towns. The Tower of London, Windsor, Warwick, each fortress a reminder that the conquerors were here to stay. To cement his authority, William introduced a survey unprecedented in scope. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, catalogued every acre of land, every village, every plough, every soul in his kingdom. It was not just record-keeping, it was control, the very measure of his power. William ruled with discipline as harsh as it was effective. To his Norman barons, he granted land and privilege. To his English subjects, he gave fear. Yet in binding them together, he laid the foundations of a united realm.
One of the unique things about Britain was that women owned a lot of land, and that after the Battle of Hastings, the women who had lost husbands at Hastings could only keep their land if they married a Norman. So it provided an incentive to create for an acceptance, a bonding of effectively the landed gender in Britain with the Norman invaders. And so you have a number of different Anglo-Saxon Norman families now that emerge out of this.
If you were to map the various raids, rebellions, and unnecessary sieges that he conducted over that time, it was a long, bitter campaign. And in fact, in the winter of 1069-70, William held his Christmas court in York. And the reason he did that, I mean, normally it would be down in London, the reason he did that was that so he could impress upon the Northerners that they had to submit to him. He followed that by an operation called the Harrying of the North, in which was basically pillaging, burning, killing the peasant population and so on. I mean, this is a disgraceful thing to do. And one of the monkish chroniclers who wrote about it said that 100,000 people died. It was not, you shouldn't kill Christians just to assert yourself. However, it's something that English kings had done before, and it actually worked. The North was pacified by that, but it was certainly brutal.
As years passed, the warrior duke grew heavy and slow. The battlefield king was now burdened with age, but his spirit remained unyielding. He waged campaigns in France, struggled against rebellious sons, and fought to preserve both Normandy and England as a single inheritance. But in 1087, fate struck once more. While leading a campaign in Normandy, William was thrown from his horse. The saddle crushed him, leaving mortal injuries. For weeks he lingered in agony in Rouen, his once mighty body failing. Even his death was marked by chaos. At his funeral, the church caught fire, mourners fled, and his bloated body burst as priests tried to lower him into a tomb too small for his frame. The king who had conquered England left the world in disorder, much as he had found it. William's legacy was monumental. He was both tyrant and visionary, brutal in conquest, relentless in rule, but also a builder of a new order. The Norman dynasty he founded would dominate England for generations. The conquest brought a new language, a new nobility, and a new vision of kingship. Castles, cathedrals, and the Domesday Book reshaped the very fabric of society. The English tongue absorbed Norman French. Laws were rewritten, and the map of England itself was redrawn. The Norman conquest was not simply a battle. It was the birth of medieval England. William the Conqueror, illegitimate, duke, king. His story is one of ambition, brutality, and survival. A man who seized a crown and transformed a nation forever.